It is aimed at you. The Republic was never what was important, ever. It was but a shell that surrounds the Jedi, just as the teachings of the Jedi are a shell surrounding the heart of man. You see, the war, the true war, has never been one waged by droids or warships or soldiers. They are but crude matter, obstacles against which we test ourselves. The true war is waged in the hearts of all living things, against our own natures, light or dark. That is what shapes and binds this galaxy, not these creations of man. You are the battleground, and if you fall, the death of the Republic will be such a quiet thing, a whisper, that shall herald the darkness to come.
Have you ever consumed a piece of Star Wars medium that just didn't sit right with you? Something about it didn't feel like the original films that we've all come to know and love. Something about the story and their characters felt off, as if it was missing something, but you couldn't quite put words to it. Or perhaps you've developed your own fan fiction or original character, but when you present it to the world, it was heavily criticized as not being Star Wars. God knows that when I first started writing, this is the exact thing that happened to me, and as I dived into the mythos of Star Wars, I slowly began to realize the mistakes I made with my characters and the stories I was trying to convey. In this video, I'm going to dive into various aspects of the Star Wars franchise, many of which are highly debated, and offer my own perspective on these topics. To back up these claims, I would be using statements and design philosophies provided by George Lucas and Dave Filoni, as well as the source material of all the Star Wars movies and the television shows, such as The Clone Wars, Rebels, and The Mandalorian, though I may sprinkle in some of the old Legends material if needed, though it's important to note that these stories are no longer canon. In this first video, we are going to do a deep dive into the one thing that makes Star Wars, and that is the Force. We're going to take a look at George's original intentions with the Force and how he slowly shaped these concepts to create both the Jedi and the Sith. We're going to take a look at the philosophies of these two polar opposite religions, as well as several different variations that we have seen in canon, and how my first original Star Wars character completely went against the philosophies of George Lucas, in hopes of showcasing the difference between good characters and bad characters. My goal with this video is to provide potential Star Wars creators with a resource on creating more grounded Star Wars characters, but also as a resource for those who want to learn more about the Force. With that being said, let's jump right into it. I believe that Star Wars reached the international popularity that it did because of its adherence to the hero's journey. The hero's journey was a concept proposed by Joseph Campbell that detailed the motifs of mythological tales across the world's cultures and religions. In his book, he goes into great length about 17 distinct stages of universal myths and how they appear in mythological stories. George has gone on to state that he saw Joseph Campbell as a mentor, and in the documentary, The Mythology of Star Wars, he went on to state that Campbell asked a lot of interesting questions and exposed me to a lot of things that made me very interested in cosmic questions and mystery. But why is the hero's journey so important to Star Wars? I believe that through modeling the first 3 Star Wars films through this story structure, George was able to create a modern-day monomyth that would be universally loved by anyone across the world. At the heart of Star Wars are the tales that have been passed from generation to generation, and it is this celebration of human culture and storytelling that has laid the foundation for the core of Star Wars stories. The original 3 films are the prototypical odyssey across the stars, as we follow Luke Skywalker and his band of ragtag heroes as they attempt to prevail over a fascist empire. What is interesting is that the prequel films follow more of your standard Greek tragedy. The set pieces feel larger than life, and are more fantastical than the first three films. We watched both The Fall of the Republic and the Jedi, as well as Anakin's fall to the dark side of the Force. All six of these films feel very familiar to the viewers. They can be watched separately, but as a whole, they present themselves as an epic narrative that documents the prophecy of Anakin Skywalker and his quest to bring balance to the Force. They show his fall to the dark side and his reascension to the light in the film Return of the Jedi. The last three films in the Skywalker saga are quite decisive in terms of fans' opinions, and I believe that these films could have been far better if they separated themselves from the Skywalker name completely. The Force Awakens, while following similar motifs that could be seen in A New Hope, had set up a strong foundation and mystery to carry the next two films in its respective sequence. But the fatal flaw of this series was the lack of planning and communication between the respective directors and writers, as well as apparent studio interference. I like the idea of Rey originally being a nobody, and that anybody could become a hero, as well as Kylo's struggle of finding his own identity that breaks away from the shadow of his grandfather. I believe that these films could have played on the idea of identity and the struggles of finding one's own voice. But what we got instead was a disjointed mess that didn't really seem to have a clear distinction on where it wanted to go. With this in mind, the first thing you need to consider when creating a Star Wars character or story is to design a motif or theme that you want to talk about. Just as George had called upon universal myths, you should look back on history and legend to design your characters and stories. Have a goal or an idea in mind before you consider the Force, planets, or factions, as these are merely the dressings on stories that deal with humanity. With an understanding of the design structures of the Star Wars narrative, we can look at the most important aspects of the series, the Force, and how George designed it to be so integral in the narrative. George's original intentions with the Force was to awaken a certain kind of spirituality in young people, more a belief in God than a belief in any particular, religious system. This is important to understand because the Force serves as an avenue to explore faith in the duality of man. It serves as a way to paint the goodness in man as well as the temptation for selfishness and evil that lingers in everyone. Through this duality, we can see the basis for light and dark. The Force in the original films did not have much explanation. It was a mystery that only had hints at a greater power. It was not about powerful Force abilities, but instead the struggle of man to do the right thing. This is important to understand before we dive into the specifics of the Force and its setting. I will address this again in order to drive home the point. The Force is a narrative tool designed around faith, spirituality, and religion, not superpowers and magical tricks. As a refresher, George's intentions with Star Wars were to create modern-day myths that use the structure of the hero's journey to tell stories that would inspire spirituality in his intended audience. Before we get into discussing the different aspects of the Force, let's talk about my first Star Wars character. When I originally wrote this character, I was in my early teens, and it was one of my first attempts at writing in general. There was a lot wrong with this character. Many of these issues were universal to all genres of writing, such as simplistic character traits, one-dimensional motives, and Mary Sue-like qualities. But on top of those poor writing techniques, he didn't really feel like a character that would belong in the Star Wars universe. He was a product of the expanded universe, and he used a plethora of Force abilities, saber techniques, and philosophies that had been developed from the various Star Wars comics, video games, and novels. Looking back, I think one of the biggest issues with designing my Star Wars characters was that I was basing them off Star Wars characters that I had read or played. Essentially, I was making a derivative based on a derivative. I had pulled myself so far away from the original source material that George's vision had been lost or misinterpreted by my young and naive self. The character I designed was named Tarlin Derricks, a mid-20s human male From the smuggler's moon, Nar Shaddaa. He was a prodigy with the Force and was a kind soul, but, as you know, Nar Shaddaa, criminals run amok and his life was ruined. It was this criminal enterprise that basically led him to joining the Sith, where he quickly rose to the ranks of the Sith Empire and took the title of Darth and became known as Darth Derrix, which is just terrible. I mean, it's god awful, and we'll get into why. During the Hundred Years of Darkness, he would go on to lead the Sith forces against the Republic and the Jedi. He would slaughter many and commit what I would consider heinous war crimes, and these war crimes had little to no effect on him. He never thought about them, they didn't affect him as a character. He just committed them, and he kept on marching. He was always conscious and claimed that he did these things for the greater good, and thus he hadn't fallen to the dark side. Slowly, he would begin to incorporate both the light and the dark into his fighting style, as he believed that it helped him maintain a balance between the dark side of the Force and the light side, and he would only call on one or the other based on the circumstances he found himself in. Only joined the Sith because he wanted to make a change in the galaxy, but he didn't follow the Sith code, and he wasn't concerned with power, but it's just terrible writing by my part. Now, I know what you're thinking, and you're probably laughing at how bad this all sounds. I know that when I look at it now, I can't help but cringe at the way he was designed. There's so much that is wrong with this character. The flaw is completely obvious to everybody. But why are these flaws wrong? Let's dive into the specifics of the Force and find out. So, one of the first things we need to understand is that the Force will most likely always be mysterious. No character should know everything about the Force. They simply have different interpretations and beliefs from other characters, as we, the audience, do not know everything as well. This is because new content is always going to be added to the series, which will in turn shape the way we see the universe. A few examples in recent times have been seen with the inclusion of the Mortis arc, which showcased the father, daughter, and son. It was a fascinating storyline that took us to a realm within the Force and explored the cycle of balance between light and dark. Another example, also found in the Clone Wars series, was the inclusion of the Wellspring of Life, which was a powerful Force nexus located in the deep core that seeped with the light side of the Force. Here Yoda learned that the Wellspring was the birthplace of midi-chlorians and perhaps life itself. In Rebels, we see the inclusion of a Force realm or plane known as the World Between Worlds that linked all of time and space together. It's clear to me that while we understand the basic fundamentals of the Force, just like the characters, we will never truly understand the deep complexities and scale of the Force and its creation. With this understanding that new things will always be introduced to the universe, we can discuss the established axioms of the universe and the Force. For those who are not aware, an axiom is a statement or proposition which is regarded as being true or accepted. When we first learn of the Force in A New Hope, Obi-Wan is quoted as saying, "Well, the Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together." This binding process happens through the little organisms known as midichlorians that can be found in the cells of all living organisms. Through these cells, the Force would be able to speak to the living. Through sensations, feelings, and for those with a high enough count, the ability to use Force powers. These creatures were first mentioned in A Phantom Menace, but George Lucas states that he had developed the concept when originally conceiving Star Wars. What is important to note about midichlorians is that it means all sentient organics are Force sensitive, and their ability for higher sensitivity is dependent upon the count they are born with. Dave Filoni backs this idea in a September 2017 interview with comicbook.com. Dave states, "To me, when you talk about the Force is in everything that's alive. That's what Obi-Wan says originally. That's true even in the days of midichlorians, which everyone is afraid to talk about, but I'm not." This statement harkens back to the Obi-Wan quote I provided earlier. It's established that the Force surrounds and fills all living things. It is through the discovery of midichlorians in all life that makes Obi-Wan's statement true. Everyone has the ability to sense or use the Force. It simply comes down to your count and your belief. Dave further states that what that tells you is, when I was a kid, I believed that everybody probably had the Force and they just didn't believe. Midichlorians actually prove that theory out. We all have them, just to filtering degrees. Dave later goes on to further this by making a comparison to Bruce Lee in the study of martial arts. He states that everyone can learn a specific skill, but their mastery of such a skill will widely vary based on the person. We see a good example of this in the 2016 film Rogue One with Chirrut Imwe, who is a member of the Guardians of Wills, which was one of the galaxy's many religious orders who, like the Jedi, had their own group of warrior monks. What makes Chirrut interesting is that he is blind in both of his eyes, but his combat skills would make you believe otherwise. He is a devout follower and believer of the Force, and his blindness never seems to get in his way. In the 2019 comic, Galaxy's Edge, Chirrut states to Hondo Okana that there are other ways to see than just with eyes. This is similar to the training that we see with Luke and Obi-Wan in A New Hope, as well as Luke's trust in the Force when destroying the Death Star. I believe Chirrut is a good example of what Dave and George were talking about. While I don't believe the Guardian held any high midichlorian count, we did see feats that seemed spectacular when compared to other characters in that film. While a character that had a low midichlorian count would not be able to compete with Anakin Skywalker, Yoda, or the Emperor, through rigorous training and a deep belief in the Force, this character would be able to elevate their skills to be above that of a normal person. It is through the cells of every living organism that binds the galaxy together. An event that causes large amounts of destruction, death, or pain can cause what are known as echoes to vibrate across the galaxy. This is seen in Yoda's reaction to the destruction of the Jedi during Order 66, as well as Obi-Wan's mention of a great disturbance in the Force when Alderaan is destroyed by the Death Star. But how is this possible? All life generates a set of emotions, feelings, thoughts, and actions. It is through daily life that the living force is fed, which in turn feeds the cosmic force of the galaxy. The living force was an aspect of the force that focused on being mindful and rooted in the present, over worrying about the uncertainties of the future. Qui-Gon Jinn was a deep practitioner and student of this aspect of the force. Qui-Gon Jinn had discovered that it was the cosmic force that allowed the force to communicate via midichlorians, and through the living force, those with special training and a firm footing in the light side of the force could achieve immortality. Qui-Gon was, as far as we know, the first person to discover this fact, though he died before he completed his training. In Season 6 of the Clone Wars, Yoda hears a voice from Qui-Gon, and he believes that this is the doing of the dark side of the Force, but in reality, it was the return of Qui-Gon, who instructed Yoda on his findings. He was quoted as saying, "All energy from the living force, from all things that have ever lived, feeds into the cosmic force, binding everything and communicating to us through midichlorians. Because of this, I can speak to you now." It seems to me that the cosmic force is where the whole idea of balance in the force can be seen. We do know that the destruction of the Jedi and the rise of the Galactic Empire, that the Force had seemingly vanished from the consciousness of a lot of the galaxy. This was in part due to the Empire's systematic destruction of Jedi temples and various religions across the galaxy, but also due to the control of the galaxy by the dark side of the Force, which seemed to lead to a turbulence in the cosmic force. It is through this turbulence that the Force abilities seem to awaken in older individuals, such as Luke Skywalker or Rey. I believe that this is because the galaxy is in a perfect balance when spirituality and faith is strong across the galaxy. This echoes similar to the Hindu idea of a yuga cycle, which believes that humanity moves through a set of cycles that showcase incremental declines in knowledge and spirituality, bringing turbulence and war, and eventually the end of the cycle and the birth of a new one. I believe the galaxy operates on cycles very similar to this. We know that technological advancements have mostly stagnated since the time of the Old Republic, and we also know that knowledge on the Force and religion declines more and more. The Jedi have become more focused on the Clone Wars, and their spirituality declines. Once Order 66 happens, we see the systematic destruction of religion across the galaxy. We are left in a religious dark age that carries across the galactic civil war and beyond. Even with the destruction of the Sith, The work towards a spiritual rebirth across the galaxy will take decades to achieve. So why does the galaxy fall into a spiritual decline? This can be explained by the dueling fates of the Force, the light and the dark. The Force itself has no clear distinction on what are the definitive limits to its powers. We see a wide array of abilities, from your standard telekinesis to altering memories, and in some cases, even magic, like that used by the Night Sisters of Dathomir. What we do know is that there are three distinct categories of the Force: light, neutral, and dark. There are a wide array of abilities that come naturally to those who are sensitive to the Force. Some of these abilities are natural and require no active thinking to take place, though most abilities require an individual to act or will it into reality. One of the most universal aspects of the Force is the ability to manipulate the physical properties of the world around you. In all reality, it comes down to the practitioner's purpose. Are they using an ability for the good of life or for selfish purposes? Let's use an example to highlight this fact. Let's say we're on Coruscant and we're walking on a crowded street and a large object comes crashing into the crowd. A light-sided individual would alter their physical realities of the world to push the object away from the crowd in an attempt to save life, while a dark-sider would have most likely been the one to push such an object in the crowd, perhaps to take out an enemy. Let's consider another Force ability, that of reading minds. This ability is innate in most Force sensitives and gives them the ability to read surface-level thoughts of an individual. Yoda and the Jedi Council employ this ability when evaluating Anakin in The Phantom Menace. Obi-Wan also uses a variation of this to send suggestions to stormtroopers in A New Hope. This prevents violence from breaking out and is considered, while questionable, a peaceful alternative to violence. Just as there are neutral and light side alternatives to these abilities, there are dark variations, such as the Mind Probe, which pries through a subconscious of their victim and tears out information the user seeks. What I'm trying to get at here is that many abilities within the Force are innate and found in all individuals. There are variations of what I consider natural abilities, and it comes down to the intentions of the user. Abilities can be molded for utilitarian or selfish purposes, and it is through the natural abilities and their applications that we begin to see the basis for the light and the dark. The light side of the Force is focused on utilitarianism and the greater good for all. Practitioners of the light side are at their strongest when they are calm and at peace. The Jedi would often practice meditation as a way to find peace within themselves. In the YouTube video, The Philosophy of Kreia, a critical examination of Star Wars, an idea is shared that I really like. The content creator states that he feels the light side of the Force is short for enlightenment, and I would tend to agree with this idea. For one to grow strong in the light side of the Force, they would have to first learn to understand themselves. It is only through the reflection of one's life that we're able to recognize the reasons for our emotions and why we do the things that we do. Once you understand this, you can learn to master your emotions and control the way you react to the challenges of life. Through enlightenment, the realities of the galaxy would begin to open itself to you. You would see that all of our actions are connected and cause echoes that traverse across time and space. You would learn that all life is connected and that all life is essentially the Force. I believe this is the reason pure light side abilities are rooted in self-sacrifice. Force healing encapsulates this idea more than any other ability. Through the transfer of one's own essence to another, light side individuals can bring others back from near-death experiences. You may be wondering why someone would do this. What is the purpose of saving others if you cannot live your own life? And to that, I would argue that a character that is truly enlightened would understand that all life is connected. Remember, all organics in the galaxy have midichlorians. Midichlorians are the blood of life and the physical manifestations of the Force. It is through the actions of the living that feed the living Force, which in turn changes the makeup of the cosmic Force. When we die, our life force returns to the cosmic Force. It is the cosmic Force that in turn helps lead to the creation of more life, and the cycle continues. We are never truly gone, as Luke states. Instead, our actions will live on through the Force, changing the cosmic footprint with each action we bring. If we wish to live a life of enlightenment, we mustn't always worry about the future. Be aware of it, but live in the present and face the challenges that stand before you. If one lives a life with integrity, then they have nothing to worry about, for they will always rise to face any problems or challenges that may present themselves. I believe this is why Qui-Gon Jinn was truly the last Jedi. He lived in the present and wasn't detached from reality, from humanity, from the nature of the Force. With his death in the Duel of the Fates came the death of true spirituality, and in its place we are left with dogmatism. That is why Qui-Gon Jinn needs to be remembered. By embracing spirituality and connectedness to the galaxy and its people, we can achieve the one thing that the dark side craves: immortality. While the light side is focused on coexisting among all of the galaxy, the dark side of the Force is the opposite. It is the aspect of the Force that draws upon negative emotions that fill our thoughts and subconscious. It feeds on our anger, hatred, and fear, and calls to us in tempting words. Yoda states that the dark side of the Force is easier to use and more seductive. This is why all Jedi must maintain vigilance and to center themselves, otherwise they would make an over-emotional decision or act out of anger or fear. For those who call upon the dark side, they'll find themselves cold and empty, and they'll have a lingering sensation that it was wrong or against nature. This is why I believe Chancellor Palpatine states in Revenge of the Sith, the dark side of the Force is the pathway to many abilities one would consider unnatural. It is unnatural because of the dark side of the Force is focused on destruction of life for the sake of one's own gain. And since all life is the Force, that means the death of the Force itself. While many Darksiders have fallen out of good intentions, those intentions rarely stay, and the change that so many sought is eventually lost as the darkness in their hearts strips away at the humanity within them, until they are merely a man that seeks out absolute power for the sake of power. Darth Sidious is a perfect example of this. Throughout the series, he uses everyone around him for his own gain. He creates an endless war that weakens and dilutes the Order from his presence. Like Darth Maul, Sidious used anyone and everyone for their abilities, and when their usefulness was over, they were executed or usurped by another pawn in his schemes. The Sith claimed to be bringers of great change to the galaxy, and that was partially true. What they brought was the destruction of religion, spirituality, and diversity across the galaxy. They promoted a reliance on uniformity and cold technology. This is why the Sith and the Empire often bore the semblance of industrial blacks and grays. They were cold and inhumane. In the process of falling, your body twists and morphs into a decaying visage. Your body reeks of death, and a coldness seems to linger over your presence. You slowly lose your name and take on a new identity. Anakin became Darth Vader, Palpatine became Sidious, Ben Solo became Kylo Ren. To embrace the dark side of the Force means you have chosen to no longer grow as an individual. Instead of confronting the emotions and reasons for why you feel the way you do, you take the easy path and lash out against a society you feel has wronged you. Yoda states in The Empire Strikes Back, if once you start down the dark path, forever will it dominate your destiny. Consume you it will, as it did Obi-Wan's apprentice. This is only partially true, and I will explain why. In the novel Dark Disciple, Asajj Ventress redeemed herself by not giving in to the dark side of the Force and sacrificing herself, just as Anakin will later do for his own son. Both of these characters were rooted deep within the dark side of the Force, but they were able to redeem themselves and fight for the greater good of life. In the end, Ventress had denounced the dark side, yet her life was still dictated by her past. She was seen with mistrust, and it wasn't until her death that she was truly redeemed. The same went for both Anakin and Ben, who redeemed themselves and shortly died thereafter. So why does Yoda claim that the dark side will always dominate your destiny if we've seen people redeem themselves? And why does it always seem those who redeem themselves die? This isn't always the case. We know that Quinlan Vos was redeemed when Ventress died, and he was pardoned for his coming to the dark side, and he was presumed to have survived the Great Jedi Purge. But even with his redemption, he still had to live with the fact that it was his actions that ultimately led to his lover dying, and with it the imprints of his brief fall would always linger with him. So this isn't to say you will always be stuck in the path of darkness, but you will always live with the reminder of your actions. To summarize, the dark side is unnatural and will only lead to more pain for oneself and the galaxy. Eventually, the user of the dark side will be lost completely and only seek power, and that won't be craved until they have power and control over the Force, which means every living thing. This is why the dark side of the Force is unnatural. It goes against the fabrics of the galaxy. It wants to destroy and control, not build and coexist. And with one dark side user, the galaxy will always be out of balance, and the cosmic force will slowly fall into turmoil until one rises to restore balance for a time being. And forever will this cycle repeat, just as the Yuga cycles of Hinduism. With an understanding of the light and the dark, let's take a brief moment to discuss the concept of gray, or the center. This was a concept that was extremely popular during the time of the expanded universe, and many touted Grey Jedi to be the answer to the extreme nature of the Jedi and the Sith. In the expanded universe, a Grey Jedi was someone that was said to walk the line of light and dark without falling into darkness. But let's consider this for a moment. Is such a thing even possible? Well, there's nothing inherently evil about knowing the dark side exists, but if one was to explore using abilities of the dark side, we would know that they would be left with fleeting feelings of wrongness, and if they continued, it would slowly take control of their life. I don't believe it is possible for anyone to spam abilities both in light and dark, as the dark side inherently corrupts and clouds the judgments of the user. Now, this isn't to say that I think the Jedi are the only path to the light side and the Sith are the only path to the dark. They are merely religions that are focused on one aspect of the Force, and we are well aware that there were countless religions across the galaxy, many of which had come to similar conclusions on the Force as the Jedi and the Sith had. But the idea of someone using both the light and the dark does not thematically fit the axioms of the setting that had been designed by George and Lucasfilm. In my eyes, the whole idea of someone being able to master both came with the rising popularity of Star Wars games, many of which had slowly gamified the Force into a set of abilities and your alignment into an RPG character stat. The Force in its nature is not something that can truly be quantified into a hard statistic. It is a literary tool that is used to explore the growth and collapse of man, and that is important to keep in mind when designing your own Star Wars characters or Force abilities. Now I know what you're thinking. What about Bendu and his claims of neutrality in the Force? Bendu was a character first introduced in the third season of the Star Wars Rebel cartoon, and as I mentioned, claimed to be the representative that stood in the center of light and dark. He was an immensely powerful character and actually had some good wisdom. He did teach Kanan Jarrus how to see through the Force and espouse wisdom about the nature of holocrons and the information they provided to Ezra. To me, Bendu represented a fatal flaw with the so-called neutral users of the Force. In the end, when the Empire arrived to Atolan and began to face off with the rebels, Bendu scorned Kanan, blaming him for breaking his so-called peace that he had desired. When asked to pick a side, he claimed neutrality, and by picking a side, he would break that ideal. Instead, Kanan pushed him, calling him a coward, and this caused Bendu to lash out in anger and began attacking both the rebels and the Empire in an attempt to force them away from the planet. After the battle, Bendu did nothing to try and stop Grand Admiral Thrawn and merely vanished, never to be seen again. Bendu in this story showcases the fatal flaw of radical centrism. To stand on the sidelines while witnessing injustice but claiming to want peace is inherently selfish, and Bendu proved this by lashing out at everyone, in an act that seemed eerily similar to calling upon the dark side. If most of the Force sensitives in the galaxy acted as Bendu did, then the galaxy would have collapsed and the Emperor would have destroyed all of life in the galaxy, shattering the peace that Bendu desired. Kreia, from the expanded universe, has a quote that sums up the philosophy of Bendu nicely.
So you will do nothing? Apathy is death, worse than death, because at least a rotting corpse feeds the beasts and insects. Apathy is death.
Apathy is death.
Apathy is death.
Claiming neutrality in all things is merely apathy hidden under a veil of intellectual words, and to believe that one can be neutral in all walks of life is a fallacy. Eventually, you will have to make a decision. And this is why no one can ever truly be neutral. With an understanding of the Force on a micro level, I believe it would be good to circle back to discuss the Force on a macro level and touch on the cosmic force and the concept of balance one last time. We know that the cosmic force is fed off energy of the living force, which is in turn fed off of the actions of the living. It is through the actions of the galaxy that shifts the balance of the cosmic force. But what about a group of people? How does that affect the balance of the planets they inhabit and the galaxy as a whole? Well, this could be explained by a force nexus or a vergence in the force. A vergence in the force could be a location or a person, such as Anakin Skywalker, which had a high concentration of force energy that attracted force sensitives to it. We know that planets touched by the Sith were desolate and devoid of life, and planets such as Morabon, Exegol, Zeos, and Asog still had lingering darkness on their surface. Malachor was a desolate wasteland that served as a graveyard after a superweapon caused the Scourge Malachor, which killed all the Jedi and Sith involved in the battle. All these planets had extreme darkness to them and bore memories of extreme pain that lingered across the lands. The video game Jedi Fallen Order displays these lingering memories well, with the psychometry ability, which allowed Cal to see the past by touching old objects that had intense memories associated with them. Planets such as Malachor and the darkness associated with them are essentially a collection of many small tragic memories that were all snuffed out at once, serving as a large cloud that clings to a particular area. In the old canon, these locations were known as wounds in the Force and served to denote when a large population of life was taken at once, causing what was essentially a hole in the Force to form. In some ways, this makes sense in the current canon. If all life is essentially the Force, and the actions of all life tips the cosmic balance, then large-scale destruction would have a seismic effect on the surrounding area as a whole. But could the opposite be seen as well? What would happen if we saw a large-scale wave of life? Well, in some aspects we do see this. The planet Mustafar is a great example of this idea. In The Rise of Skywalker, in the opening sequences, we see Kylo Ren cutting down Sith cultists in an iron tree forest. This is actually an area of Mustafar known as Korvax Fen, which was being lived in by a group of Sith cultists who sought to restore the lushness that once covered the mining world. Perhaps if the group had enough time, they could have restored the planet's natural landscape. There's no direct proof that these cultists would have removed the dark side, and I doubt they would have, as they were Sith cultists themselves. But it does leave an interesting question. Could decades of planetary nurture restore a planet from its dark side corruption? I certainly think it could. Just as a lightsider can fall to the dark side and a darksider can be redeemed, planets in the galaxy itself are no different. It will always ebb and flow based on the stage of the cosmic force. The actions of all individuals determine the fate the galaxy ends up in. If you want to live in a galaxy filled with peace, compassion, and a better life for all, then it's up to you to bring that change. Take the small steps, and each action will compound into something greater. Only through recognizing your own problems and feelings will you be able to recognize the plight of man is not an experience that only you experience. Instead, you'll see that all individuals experience hardship, pain, and grief, and it is up to all of us to be there for one and another. This, I believe, was George's true intentions with the Force. Before I close off this video, I want to circle back and touch on my terrible Star Wars character. A lot of it can be chalked up to being a novice and a beginner, but it'd be good to point out what was exactly wrong about the character, now that we have a better understanding about the design philosophies of the Force. For a refresher, my first character was a Sith named Tarlin Derricks who fell to the dark side after witnessing the horrors of the criminal underworld. He was someone that claimed to be a Sith in name only, and sought to bring social change to the galaxy, and thus all of his killing and genocide did not plunge him into darkness due to his intentions. He was someone that used both the light and the dark side of the Force, and it could be switched mid-fight depending on the circumstances. He eventually rose to the title of Darth and took the name Darth Derricks, and would continue to fight and do evil things until I abandoned the character. So, right off the bat, his story about falling to the dark side doesn't sound terrible. It makes sense that a character like that would want to bring a social change to places like Nar Shaddaa, based off all of the criminal terror he witnessed on the Smuggler's Moon. But while his intentions for wanting to bring change were noble, slaughtering swaths of people is in no way a light side act. It would have shaped him, and slowly he would have lost the sight of his social change. Instead, he would have killed the gangs and criminals and would have attempted to enact his own cruel form of totalitarianism. Claiming to do something for good reasons does not excuse the fact that he abused the Force, twisting it and molding it to destroy life around him. And someone like that would have been so far gone that there would be no way he would be able to call upon the light side of the Force. And the fact that he was using offensive light side abilities is absurd. The light side of the Force is defensive and about maintaining life, not destroying it. As mentioned in the Gray Force user section of the video, it's not possible to walk both the light and the dark. Once you started using the dark side, it would corrupt you like a cancer. Lastly, his name, Darth Derricks. It's not a bad name per se, but it goes against the theme of the dark side and the Sith. Outside of Maul, all Sith that have reached the title of Darth gave up their name and took on a new title. It's supposed to represent the loss of oneself and their humanity. Simply giving him his last name with the title of Darth showed a complete lack of understanding on my part. I had this notion that being a deep-rooted Darksider meant that you could still have your humanity, but that's simply not the case. In the end, he was a problem that highlighted the fact that I didn't understand Star Wars, and to an extent, I still don't. I've developed my own opinions and thoughts on the subject, and I've tried to design more realistic characters for this setting, but it's always changing, and I'll never know the true thoughts of George, and that's okay. All we can do is continue to reflect on our past, study the texts, and come to our own conclusions and grow as people. If you like this video, I have more content similar to this planned. The next topic I'll be discussing is the themes of the Jedi, as well as their history and legends and canon. If you enjoy deep dive videos and analysis and opinions, feel free to subscribe. Thanks, and have a good one.